If you're just joining us, if you could put your name, your title, and organization in the chat, that'd be helpful as a sign-in, and also just to give our presenters the opportunity to know who is in the audience. So just want to welcome everybody. My name is Ann Richmond. I am director of the Sustainable Cities Network and Project Cities program. I want to welcome you to our virtual meeting today to provide information and the opportunity on the Arizona Cities Race to Zero campaign being organized and promoted by C40. We're very excited to have the opportunity to talk about this important campaign and encourage more of our cities to get involved. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. So if you are not speaking, which most of you won't be at this point, if you could make sure to keep your audio on mute, that would be greatly appreciated. I don't see anybody calling in via their phone, but if you are calling in, just make sure at the question and answer part, if you want to ask a question, you just need to press *6 to unmute yourself, and then you can use your phone controls after that. I would like to introduce my Sustainable Cities Network and Project Cities support team that is helping in the background with technical and Zoom support. So we've got Steve Brossel, who's our program manager for Project Cities, who is our techno geek. So he knows how to work everything Zoom. So I really appreciate your help. And then we've got Sam Dent and Kate Hartland, who are Sustainable Cities Network grad program assistants, and really appreciate their support as they help keep everybody muted and of course answer any questions that people might have. If you do run into issues, feel free to send us a note in the chat and we can help you individually, you know, if you run into problems. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to, for those of you that are not familiar with the Sustainable Cities Network, we are an education and outreach program of the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and the Global Futures Laboratory. We started in 2009. It is a free and voluntary network for our Arizona local cities, towns, counties, and tribal community practitioners, many of which are in attendance today, which is great. And our goal is to help them share best practices, interface with ASU students and researchers, but also more importantly, collaborate and be educated on what's happening around them and their communities and the nation and the world and how they can get involved in that. Quickly, I'd like to acknowledge our Sustainable Cities Network Steering Committee chairs, which are Braden Kay, who's Sustainability Director with the City of Tempe, and we have our co-chairs, Fatima Luna, who's the Climate and Sustainability Policy Advisor for the City of Tucson, and Tim Connor, who is unfortunately on vacation this week, who is manager of the Office of Environmental Initiatives for the City of Scottsdale. So thank you all for your support. So many of you, I'm sure, are intrigued by what is the Arizona Cities Race to Zero. We're very excited for our guest speakers to cover that topic, as well as discuss how cities and towns can sign on, get involved, and of course, the valuable long list of resources that are available to cities and towns through ICLEI, and then also CDP. And so Phoenix has been accepted into C40 in 2019, which I think has helped guide the city in their many environmental, sustainability, and climate action related planning efforts. And Phoenix is the first right now, I believe, Arizona city to sign on to the Race to Zero. Willa, who's with the mayor's office, let me know that Mayor Gallego is a North American co-chair of C40, and Race to Zero is a key initiative leading up to COP26 in November. And so she will actually be speaking to other mayors about Race to Zero coming up at the Arizona League of Cities and Towns event next week. And so she wants to make sure as many mayors and town managers around the state are familiar with that particular program and have the opportunity to participate. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have Laura J., who is Regional Director of North America with C40, and she is based in hot and humid Chicago. Welcome, Jay. We also will have, speaking after Laura, Josh Radoff. I hope I said that correctly, Josh.
Radoff, but that's okay.
Radoff.
I'll accept it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and he's representing ICLEI. He is the Zero Carbon Cities Advisor, and ICLEI is also called Local Governments for Sustainability. So I often get the question, what does ICLEI stand for? And it doesn't really stand for like an acronym. So it stands for Local Governments for Sustainability. So welcome, Josh. And then we will have Lila Asher, who is the Senior Associate for Cities Engagement with CDP North America, talk. And she lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and currently working on her master's in urban planning. So what is the weather like in Manitoba right now?
Well, I'm not actually in Manitoba right now. I'm actually at my parents' house in Kentucky currently, and the weather is similar to Chicago, very hot and humid.
Well, that might be, yeah, a good thing. You never know. I'm not sure what the weather might be up there, but well, good. Well, great. Well, it's wonderful to have you. We are recording this presentation. So for those of you that want to refer to it later, we'll have it added to our Sustainable Cities meetings page, and I'm happy to follow up with you all afterwards with the speaker's contact information and the recording link. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura. And if you wouldn't mind just telling people a little bit about yourself to start off with, and then we can go ahead and get started. And we will have about a half hour of presentations, and then we will probably start our Q&A around about 1:45 to 2. So that we can leave plenty of time for cities to ask questions. Josh has a hard stop at 2, so we want to make sure if anybody has any ICLEI related questions, he can answer those before he has to leave. So Laura, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Anne, and thank you everybody for taking the time to come listen to us today. We're really excited to speak to all of you about this critical, really important initiative called the Cities Race to Zero. So, as Anne introduced, I'm Laura J., the Regional Director for North America at C40, working, and we're so excited that Phoenix has been accepted in as a member, and just really looking forward to engaging cities and communities in Arizona as part of this important kind of global initiative on climate, and really helping support both in Phoenix and beyond within the region, advancing climate action. And so we are gonna, I'm gonna start with an overview of what the Race to Zero is, and then I'm gonna turn over to Josh to kind of get into some of the details of a bit, kind of what does this mean for you? What are some of the resources that are available? And Lila's gonna speak on that a little bit too, from CDP's perspective, and then talk a little bit about kind of the reporting and accountability for this initiative. And then, as Anne said, we'll have time for Q&A. So I wanted just to start with, oh, yes, Anne.
I was going to say, we are seeing your presenter view.
Oh, sorry. What happened? Okay, let me try this again. I feel like we tested it and it worked. And then, of course, now it's not working. Okay. Let me try one more time. How about now?
Perfect.
That's better? Okay. I don't know what I did different, but it's working now. Okay. So just to kind of start out with, what is the Race to Zero? And so the Race to Zero is a global campaign that is organized by the United Nations. And it's working to rally cities, regions, businesses, investors, all to commit and work towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think that kind of one really key component of this is that, and I'll touch a little bit on kind of the international climate negotiations and processes, but I think for a long time, the only avenue to engage on this has really been from national governments. They are the ones that are kind of engaging at the international space on addressing climate change. And really what the Race to Zero is the first kind of acknowledgement and mechanism for cities and regions and others to have a way to engage in this global process. And that's really, it's new, it's unique, and it really, I think it speaks to all of the hard work that has been done by cities over the past, 10 plus years. And that's really what this is about, is really about kind of implementing those actions locally on the ground that align with this target, and helping create change at the scale globally that we all know is needed. And so really connecting that local to global is really what the campaign's about. So there's over almost 800 cities that have currently signed on to the Cities Race to Zero, 3,000 businesses, 600 universities, 31 regions currently. And so, but with a long way to go, I think that this is really around bringing in as many as possible. And so the Cities Race to Zero is really that city-specific tract of the Race to Zero. And what it really is aiming to do is to deliver a better future by addressing equity together with the environment and climate change, and to build really kind of broad coalitions to achieve that. This is a quote from Mayor Garcetti, who's the mayor of Los Angeles and the current chair of C40, really that, as the first generational leaders that really are recognizing the scale of what needs to happen, that the Cities Race to Zero becomes kind of the rallying mechanism for us all to work together to achieve that. And that's really the main purpose of it. And so who is already in the race? We have 88 cities in the United States, one in Arizona, Phoenix. And so would love through this call to get more of you to join and participate and really work together as a region and as a state to really help achieve these goals. And so we'll kind of get into how to join. But I wanted to touch a little bit on kind of the moment that is coming up that is really important to the global conversation, and the impact and showcasing all the work that you all are doing locally and helping kind of influence that is really around COP26. So for those who aren't kind of as familiar with the COP process, COP stands for Conference of Parties. And this is the international space where nations come together to create agreements on how to address this global issue. So the Paris Agreement that was decided in 2015 was really the first time the nations kind of came together and said, this is the target that we have as a global community. And this year in Glasgow is where each national government now needs to say, okay, so this is how we're actually going to achieve that. These are the targets that we're going to reach by 2030, and these are the targets we're going to reach by 2050. And that's why it's so important that cities and businesses and others are also coming and saying, hey, and this is how we're going to do it too. And this is why we're going to do it, because it's going to make people's lives better in our community. And so that's really kind of at its heart what this is about. And I think there's so much that's relevant to this in the United States right now. And with I think all of the very active conversations that are happening on Capitol Hill right now around the infrastructure bill. And so much of that aligns with the implementation of the objectives that are within the Cities Race to Zero. And Josh is going to touch a little bit on kind of some of the market trends and how this is really feasible. But, I think that there's so much domestic focus action on this that it really does speak to kind of the need to create these ambitious targets, but also that help open the door for these different opportunities that are going to be coming down from things like the infrastructure bill. So what is the pledge? So really kind of at its heart, there's 5 requirements that are part of kind of joining the Cities Race to Zero. The first is to endorse a set of principles, and these are about putting equity and inclusion at the heart of all climate action making decision, committed to really achieving those goals that were set in the Paris Agreement, recognizing that we're in a climate emergency. This does not mean that you have to set a formal climate emergency for your city, but it's a recognition that this is an urgent issue. And really to work with partners and coalitions, which I think that so many of you are already doing at the local level. The other ones are really around pledging targets and setting an interim target with a 2030 that is really consistent with a fair share of a 50% global emissions reductions, which is what the Paris Agreement has set out. And Josh is going to touch on what that means a little bit more. And then really kind of identifying at least one high impact action for your city to focus on that aligns with these targets. And as part of the commitment, there's a whole list of actions that you can choose from. And again, we're going to touch a little bit on support for really how to then go about implementing those. And then really number 5 is around publishing your target and your actions. And this is about accountability. You know, this is an initiative that has longevity beyond COP this year, and it's really about accountability and making sure that there's action behind it. And so that's really kind of what Lila will touch on a little bit with CDP's work. So it's very simple on how to join. It's citiesracetozero.org. We'll put it in the chat. It's a very kind of simple form to sign on. It's not meant to be onerous at all. And so, you know, we can kind of, if there's any questions afterwards, we're available. But this is just kind of a very quick snapshot of the steps. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh now to kind of touch on some of these other kind of more specifics.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about some of the two aspects. One is the science-based target, and then in my mind, what's really important for us to understand is, like, is there a viable path? Is there a feasible path to meet the science-based targets? Otherwise, we're just sort of setting things that are abstract. So first of all, I feel like science-based targets are a real game changer for this conversation. Yes, they mean having a zero carbon goal by 2050, but I think more importantly, they mean having a 2030 goal that is in line with the Paris Agreement, and that being to sort of maintain temperatures below 1.5 C. So it's not an arbitrary goal, it's really a science-based goal. I think that's important. And essentially, when we are sort of like working with cities to update their climate plans, you know, so much changes so fast. You know, if you think about the differences in technology between now and a couple of years ago, the difference in attitude, the differences in policy environment, there's a lot that's different, and we think like it is important to sort of keep this updated. So in terms of how the methodology works, Laura mentioned, next slide, please, Laura, the 50% fair share. Essentially, if you take a 50% goal internationally and then apply it to countries, including the US in our case, on a fair share basis, meaning proportional to Human Development Index, that effectively means that the US has, depending on your inventory year, whether it's 2016 to 2019, effectively a 63% per capita reduction. And you can see the numbers that we have. These are based on about 100 cities that are in the ICLEI system that have completed inventories within the ICLEI system. So when we say science-based targets, we're really talking about 63% per capita emissions reductions by 2030, right? So that means we need to be taking immediate and fairly aggressive actions to get that. It doesn't mean that cities are expected to do all of that themselves, but that there is a handshake between cities and states and the federal government and private sector. Next slide, please, Laura. Just for context, I think it's important to say that when we're talking about this, yes, we think a great first step in this all is to, or a continuation of process is to establish a science-based target that has a 2030 component, and to incorporate rapidly changing trends around electric vehicle adoption, for example, or grid decarbonization. We also want programs not to narrowly focus only on carbon. We really think successful programs include aspects of health and resilience and equity. Fourth, again, we acknowledge that local governments can't do it alone, and that the collaboration with cities and states and utilities is really critical. And that, I think there's some question about, to what degree should we put effort into creating inventories or updating inventories. And I think it is worth everyone examining how that can be streamlined, how it can be made more efficient, but really think it helps to have data to inform decisions. And that's not just climate data. I think that could be also equity data, access to nature type of data, health related data, anything that can sort of help planning in that regard. Next slide, please. So again, looking at those 100 cities that we have in our system, this is US wide. This is kind of how most cities break down with a number one component of transportation, which, if people didn't know, transportation US wide took over as the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. So addressing transportation is a big deal for cities. It's a big deal for the country. And then after that, you have buildings, whether it's residential or commercial, and you have a breakdown of fuels, fuels, mostly natural gas in buildings, and then electric in those buildings. If you have industry, that might skew how you are. So the next slide says Florida, and the reason it doesn't say Arizona is because we only have 2 cities in our Arizona system, and we didn't feel like it was a very representative sample. So Florida has a similar climate. We just did a session with a group of Florida cities, so we're showing them. My guess is that it's pretty similar. The outcomes will be here. If that's offensive to anyone, the liberty I've taken, I apologize. I could see how it might be, but anyway, I think the main difference is there's not as much fuel use in warm places. And maybe that's a real no duh for most people here. But I think that really sort of changes what the emphasis is in terms of how you approach this. And when I say fuel use, I mean natural gas in buildings. There's a higher percentage of fuel use overall, or emissions from on-road fuel use. So anyway, this will focus, what our high impact actions should be in a climate like this or with an emissions profile like this. Next slide, please. So I mentioned high impact actions. Really, if we reduce things down to their sort of essential elements, if you want to decarbonize, you need to do the 3 things on the left. You need a clean grid because we rely heavily on electrification. You need buildings to not use a lot of natural gas. So in Arizona, you probably already don't use a lot of natural gas. But what we found out in Florida, and this may be true in Arizona too, is that buildings are just built very inefficiently. And so you have real grid resilience and reliability issues, given the fact that it's hotter and hotter, you need more and more air conditioning. And there's some real resilience challenges, given the lack of efficiency in buildings. Whether that's true in Arizona as well, I don't know. And then you need to convert vehicles to EV. For those of you who are steeped in the transit and alternative modes of mobility, vehicle miles traveled, VMT reduction is still critically important. It supports a lot of the equity, health, and other aspects of the city. I just sort of call it out in parentheses because while I think it is necessary, I don't think it's sufficient. And then on the right are what we call supporting features. These are not necessarily going to sort of get you to zero or to a science-based target, but they're, I think, critical components of a robust sustainability program, particularly, as I mentioned before, the resilience, health, and equity angles or aspects. Next slide, please. So again, we sort of recognize, especially in the regulated West from a utility perspective, in Colorado, we skipped over that, the weather's nice here, it's a little hot, that there may be limited opportunities at the municipal level, right? But there's a lot of really great, and I would say emerging examples out there of cities seeing their role a little differently in terms of voices on behalf of their own communities at the state level and sometimes nationally or at the utility level. Des Moines is a great example recently that partnered with its utility to essentially create a deal to procure 100% renewable energy. Colorado enabling the utility to invest in EV infrastructure, essentially removing barriers that may have existed for them. And then states around the country, and I think Arizona is a good candidate for this, removing barriers to enable utilities to incentivize fuel switching, like electrification. I think Arizona may have a current barrier to doing that. So those are just some examples, and there's lots of them out there. Next slide, please, Laura. I think if we're saying, can we reach these goals, it's important to see, well, what are the current trends? So we'll start with electrification of vehicles. There is already a real groundswell of conversion to electric vehicles happening. We're at about 3 to 4% of new vehicles being electric in 2021. Projections say that we'll be at about 30% of new vehicles that are electric by 2030. In California, that number is about twice as high. In Palo Alto, it's like 2.5 times as high. In the Midwest, it was about half of that. So it really sort of varies, but I think we're not, which is why I have the Midwest note there. It's not like we're trying to, like 10 years ago, hope that electric vehicles become a thing. It's already happening. There's already adoption happening. We just need to figure out how to accelerate it. So that makes me optimistic. Next slide. Similarly, on the grid has reduced by 40% in greenhouse gas emissions since 2005, 52% based on where we thought it would be in 2005. And if you just linearly extrapolate it, we'll get to zero in 2030. no one actually thinks that's what's going to happen, but Biden's clean energy standard suggests getting to 80% by 2030, right? So we think it is within the realm of technical possibility. And, renewables are the cheapest fuel. It's really a matter of how fast can we accelerate the retirement of various fossil assets. Next slide. That is, first, I think I rearranged these, sorry. This is new capacity of power coming on in the United States in 2021. You can see it's almost all renewables with some natural gas still coming on as well. So also we added the first nuclear, if people are interested in that little side note, in 30 years in Georgia, which is what that 3% is. Next slide. This is what's come offline in the last 10 years or so. You could see it's mostly coal plants and some gas plants coming offline, some nuclear coming offline as well, which actually creates a challenge because that bumps up a region's emissions factors and needs to be accommodated by new renewables. So again, the right trends. Next slide, please. This is just a map of where the new renewables are in 2021, according to EIA. So a handful of solar arrays in Arizona to point to. Also looks like some, I can't actually read what color that is, but I think maybe those are batteries. But I like this map just because it kind of gives a sense of where the renewables are being developed. Next slide. This was a study that came out earlier, a couple months ago, which just showed what's in the queue, the interconnection queue. So if you want to develop new power, you have to get it interconnected into the grid and you have to line up. So there's a queue for it. And you can just see like how overwhelmingly dominated it is everywhere in the country, especially on the West, our non-ISO region, with renewables, predominantly wind and solar. And that's 100 gigawatts of renewables in the queue. That's a ton. So again, a lot to be optimistic about there. Next slide. Arizona, I just feel encouraged for you. I was looking up the largest solar plants in the country, and you're in the top 5 there. You also have the largest nuclear plant in the country. You probably know all this already. You're the second in generation from solar and the third in capacity, which just means that you get more out of your solar for every amount of capacity, which makes sense because you have great resource. So a lot to sort of be optimistic about, at least on the solar side. Next slide. When we talk about a decarbonization plan, again, because you're not using a lot of natural gas, if you look at the graph in the upper left there, most of that natural gas is going to power plants. So your decarbonization plan very much looks like get the coal and natural gas out of your power, and then take the motor gasoline out of your vehicles, right? And so those are 2 strategies. Those are clean the grid and convert to electric vehicles. Next slide, please. In terms of cleaning the grid, as you I'm sure know, Arizona does have a renewable portfolio standard at 15%. And I think we're in this moment where a lot of states are updating and getting very serious and more aggressive about their renewable portfolio standards. Establishing 100% standard, often by 2050 with a more interim standard, like you can see California doing at 60% by 2030. Next slide. The utility, there is, Arizona Public Service does have a commitment. So we're trying to sort of get commitments to move to legally binding requirements. And again, move from just having something by 2050 to having a short-term goal of 2030. So it's not that there is nothing happening at all in Arizona. There's actually a lot of good foundation here. Next slide, please. Let's see. Sorry. This slide was supposed to be hidden. Go ahead. Next slide. I think I replaced it. So is this one. Okay, they didn't get updated. Go back. I'll just use those 2.
Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. Go back. I'll just use these. I think these are just policy mechanisms that exist around the country to enable more renewable energy development. On the left is community choice aggregation. The one that I updated with shows that Arizona is considering community choice aggregation, which would mean that local governments could effectively create a program where they would procure renewable energy on behalf of their community. And you could do opt-in or opt-out versions of that. Utah just came up with a new community choice aggregation-like program that's worth checking out. And then on the right, there's a community solar enabling legislation. And while Arizona doesn't have that, there are some utilities that have community solar programs within Arizona. So again, it looks very well uncolored in there on these maps, but there are actually, I think, some movement, which again, you all may be involved in. Next slide, please. This was just showing that you don't have retail choice in Arizona, which just sort of limits that ability. We can move through that. Next slide, please. This is what I get for updating slides until the very last minute. My apologies. Next slide, Laura. I'll skip that one. I spoke to it already. So in terms of like, what are your goals here, or what should your strategies be? You know, there's in general, these kind of 5 sort of large buckets are the choices that people have. You know, and again, they fall into grid, vehicles, and buildings. Again, because you don't have a lot of gas in buildings, the big focus is grid decarbonization, which is why I spent a little more time on that. Vehicle electrification, and then I added building efficiency, especially around existing buildings, to essentially get more out of the electricity that's available. Next slide. So what we've been doing, and again, this is Florida, is running scenarios for individual cities or groups of cities to say, okay, well, if your starting point emissions wise is wherever it is, and you want to get to that science-based target of 63% reduction, what mix of strategies will get you there? And is that a reasonable, are those sort of reasonable things to be able to achieve? So I'll draw your attention first to the bottom row, which shows the net per capita emissions that are achieved in each individual column of measures. And then the line above that is just how many of the cities in our system actually get to the science-based target in that. And, you know, I guess whether or not you're at 62% or 64% is less important than the aggregate emissions that are achieved. So if you look at I would say let's see, rows 3 and 4 out of 5, or columns 3 or 4 out of 5, they're low renewable energy cost grid. That's an NREL scenario, and the clean energy standard, that's the Biden plan. And then a few different scenarios underneath that, namely like your EV adoption of 4.5% as opposed to the average of 3% that we expected. And then you are sort of addressing buildings as well. You know, you could see that you have anywhere within those scenarios of a 52 to a 67% reduction. So that's getting us where we need to get to by 2030. And again, for me, that's the initial gut check. Is there a possibility? And then once we sort of get a sense of that, then cities can go back and I think update climate plans with those kind of specific targets in mind, and then back them up with the policies that are needed to get there. And that could be, we'll use the emerging, say, community choice aggregation legislation to procure renewables and get ourselves down to zero. Next slide. So, these are so this is just our process. We're working with cities to kind of identify, okay, let's start with the 100% renewable energy goal, and then just disaggregate based on what state you're in, what's your policy mechanism, what you have available. Similarly for vehicles, next slide, is just essentially unpacking vehicles into all the different aspects of that, whether it's personal vehicles, transit, shared mobility, delivery vehicles, city fleets, and then essentially say, well, there are best practice policies in all of those. So let's just sort of create a plan for what that adoption rate looks like in the community, and then what can local governments do to support that. So that's kind of our current engagement mode with the cities that we're working with on Race to Zero. And with that, I think, next slide. Yes, I'm going to turn it over to Lila. She's going to talk about how CDP is supporting with various tools and reporting support. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. You guys always have such impressive technical info to share with everyone. So I'm sure everyone now understands what science-based targets are and how they work. So I'll just briefly go over the CDP supports that we have to help you with those. This support is available to any city who is not a member of ICLEI or C40. If you are a member of one of those networks, you should reach out to them. For CDP support with your targets, we do ask that you start by reporting a bit of data. on the current status of your targets through our platform. You should report the target that you have, even if you're not sure if it's ambitious enough. And if you don't have a target yet, you should report that too. That way we'll know where to start off in our support for you. We have a technical manager on staff who will be able to assist you in checking and setting your science-based targets. For making sure that it's aligned with carbon budget to looking at pathways for reduction. We also have a number of published resources that are available to anyone for help getting started with science-based targets. We'll make sure that those can get sent around, but there's a recording of a webinar that we did a while ago, a complete guide that's put out by the Science-Based Targets Network, and then some background FAQs to help you get started or if you have any questions. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just to reemphasize, no matter where you are in the process of setting a science-based targets, we are able to help you. We may just check it and be like, yes, you're good, or we might check it and then help you make it stronger. Or if you don't have one yet, we'll be able to walk you through the process. So it's important to start with that reporting so that we know how to help you. Next slide, please. So additionally, CDP offers support with the action implementation aspect of the Race to Zero through our Matchmaker program. When you report data on sustainable infrastructure projects in need of financing through the CDP reporting system, that data is showcased to some of our investor stakeholders. Through Matchmaker programs like the Catalyze cohort, we work with you to develop those projects to showcase to investors and make connections with your own finance departments. This can help accelerate and support the projects that you're working on for your climate actions. We will send more information about Matchmaker around as well, and we'd love to talk with you more about that opportunity. So definitely email us if you have questions. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so we have a great example of that type of financing support that you can access through Disclosure and from Matchmaker from right here in Phoenix. So I know we have some Phoenix people on the line. I'm going to talk a little bit about your green bond that you put out. So Phoenix was part of CDP's Sustainable Finance Training Cohort last year, and they came out with a bond that's linked to the financing for their drought resiliency programs. The bond issuance was approximately 400 million in total, and it was split into two series, one that was certified for sustainability and the other one that was just like a normal bond. And the two bonds, they were otherwise identical. Both of them did extremely well, but the sustainability bond actually outperformed the normal one, showing that there is appetite for these projects among ESG investors. By making this link to sustainability, the city of Phoenix was able to save money and gain cheaper access to capital. CDP was proud to support this work through the Sustainable Finance Training Cohort, and we were also referenced in the use of proceeds for the bonds. So thanks, Phoenix, for that, as one way for investors to check on the city's progress and check on what's being done with the bond money. So when you're thinking about financing for your high impact actions, keep in mind that we have these resources available to support you. Okay, next slide, and we're just going to go into the reporting aspect now. So yes, thank you. So reporting is the fifth requirement of your Race to Zero commitment, and I just want to take a beat to clarify why it's important. A large part of the Race to Zero is about making those ambitious commitments for COP26, but as Laura mentioned, the race doesn't just stop this November. The campaign will continue on, and we need to ensure that the goals that you set are being acted on. By reporting your progress annually, you're checking in with yourselves and with us to confirm that you're still on track. You're also setting an example of climate leadership for other cities and for national governments. The more cities that join the race, the more influence we collectively have over global climate policy. Backing up your commitment with data is very important. So starting next year, reporting is going to be mandatory for Race to Zero signatories. Next slide, please. Thanks. So you can fulfill the reporting requirements for Race to Zero through the CDP platform, and reporting with us has a number of other benefits. The reporting platform is unified with a number of ICLEI programs, and we also support reporting for the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, and WWF's One Planet City Challenge. You can report to all of those initiatives through the CDP platform. When you report, you also join our network of over 950 cities disclosing globally and benefit from benchmarking your progress against peer cities and against the standard that we've developed through working with this network over the years. We offer individual feedback and scoring to help you understand your progress and data gaps over a variety of environmental topics. And we have webinars and workshops throughout the year to talk about best practices for climate action and available resources. Next slide. Thanks. So we have a number of disclosures from Arizona already, so you'll be in good company. We have, if anyone from Flagstaff, and I know I've seen people from Phoenix and Tempe and Mesa here on the line today, we thank you so much for your participation. We'd love to see that list grow even further with other cities from Arizona. And I also wanted to mention the corporations that disclosed with us. It's 2020 numbers for the corporations, 2021 numbers for the cities. But we have a number of Arizona-based companies that disclose with us in our corporate wing. And in particular, I want to shout out APS. They've been disclosing with us since 2010, and they're now one of only 2 A-rated public investor-owned power utilities. So that's a great resource for collaboration in Arizona with them, because they've been really putting in the work. From the reports of these cities and companies, we see how dealing with climate risk is important from a business and management perspective in Arizona. As much as Race to Zero is about leading on the global stage, it's also about making smart decisions to manage risk on the local level. Long-range planning needs to take climate into account to ensure viability, and managing climate risk is something that investors are also looking for, as we talked about with the Phoenix project. A sustainability example can help open more financing doors. Taking a stance with the Race to Zero shows that you're taking climate change seriously. You can also report the infrastructure projects that you're looking to finance. Our 2021 disclosures reported projects totaling 160 million. And projects like these are important drivers for the local economy, both pulling in investment and creating jobs. And they're a major component not only of climate mitigation through the Race to Zero, but also for climate adaptation, dealing with issues like drought and heat waves that will get worse in Arizona as climate change intensifies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now let's talk about how to tackle this reporting. As I mentioned before, reporting will be mandatory for Race to Zero signatories starting in 2022. By mandatory, we mean that you should be as thorough as you can, ideally by the CDP scoring deadline. Actually, if you could go stay on that last one. Thank you. Ideally,
Sorry, I didn't mean to advance.
That's okay. Just a little preview for everyone of what's coming next. So for 2022 and onwards, by mandatory, we mean that you should be as thorough as possible, ideally by our CDP scoring deadline, to receive all the benefits of participation. However, for this year, you're not completely off the hook either. This year, for 2021, we're asking that you still report what you have, even if it's incomplete or like a whole mess and you don't have it all together yet. That's totally fine. Just get something up there in the reporting platform as soon as you have a chance. If you have already reported for 2021, so those 4 cities that I shouted out earlier, that's fantastic. You're nailing it. If you haven't opted into the Race to Zero already from your dashboard, don't worry, we can fix that opt-in for you once you officially sign on to the race. If you haven't already reported for 2021, that's okay, because there's still time. We're past the official CDP scoring deadline for this year. That was on July 29th, but you can still report. You're in time to get feedback for the Global Covenant of Mayors or WWF's One Planet City Challenge if you report by August 31st, which is still kind of soon, but we are keeping the reporting platform open until December 10th to give you all time to get through your first reporting year for Race to Zero. So plenty of time to get that done, and we're here to help you as you go through the questionnaire. As Laura mentioned earlier, this reporting piece is really important as a signal of accountability that you're acting on your commitments. And then once you report this year, next year, you'll be already a pro at using our platform. So next slide, please. This is just a bit of the nuts and bolts. You should start reporting by logging into your CDP account. So if you don't have a CDP account, email us and we can help you get that set up. And then just to quickly note, in case you're wondering, there's no fee for any of this. Once you're in your account, you can opt into Race to Zero from your reporting dashboard and then click through to work on the questionnaire. We have published a separate guide for Race to Zero showing the important questions to focus on. Pretty much all of them are in section 5 of the questionnaire for mitigation, but there are a few others in there as well. It doesn't hurt to fill out the other sections too if you have time. If you've reported to CDP before, yes, if you've reported to CDP before, you'll be glad to know that there are no additional reporting requirements for Race to Zero beyond what you've already been doing. And the questions that are looked at for Race to Zero are like significantly less than the whole questionnaire. Like I mentioned, it's really mostly just section 5 and there are 12 sections. So you're not tasked with doing the entire CDP questionnaire for this year. So that should save you some time. And also this goes for everyone all the time. There are no minimum requirements to submit your questionnaire. Of course, we prefer if you are as thorough as possible, but if you're running out of time or you can't find some specific piece of data, it's totally fine to just skip that and report what you have. So as you go to submit, please note that you do have to report publicly for Race to Zero. And if you have any questions as you go through this process, feel free to reach out and we are here to help you.